mark for you, without going too deeply into the anatomy, some salient points which will give you clues as to where a figure is, of what's happening in the figure. These points are places where the bony skeleton comes to the surface, because unlike the cranium, unlike the skull, which is an external in the main skeleton, this is an internal skeleton. Most of the time, the long bones go down the middle of limbs and are well covered. You can't see them, but there are places where they come to the surface, or near to the surface, and these surface points are very useful to identify. Now, take a standing figure. It has to achieve balance, standing on quite small platforms. Now, I'm going to assume for this one that the figure's taking most of the weight on one leg. The result of this is that the pelvis, the hips, tilt. Now, how you can see the amount of pelvic tilt you've got is by identifying 2 points. You can probably feel them on your hip. They're the edges of the pelvis. There's a sort of point, an angle. Now that is nearly always visible, even on a well-covered individual, and that applies to all of these points I'm going to indicate. Now, the general direction taken by the weight-taking leg in this case is going to be coming towards the center of balance. Now, this is representing the center of gravity. Now, if you take that vertical line, you're going to expect that the head is going to be is directly above what I can hitherto call the weight-taking foot. That's the contact with the ground. That's where your center of balance is. Now, given that that's the leg that's taking the weight, then by extension, this one isn't. This one is slack. It can move. It can be a lot of places because it's not really strongly taking the weight. Now, what happens to the upper body in this case is that the pelvis is a fixed structure, and it's the end of the spinal column. Now, the spinal column at that point has to come at right angles from the pelvis. It can't do anything else. But it then tries to turn. It has a lot over its whole length. It has some flexibility, but each individual vertebra can't move very much. So it curves back again like that. Then the natural effect of that is to have a counter tilt of what we call the shoulder girdle. Again, I can actually feel the ends of your collarbones or clavicles, very bony there. Again, even a fat individual, they're still there, but they may be dimples. Now those two, there are 2 more points. We've now got 4. You can look for those. In fact, the whole of the length of each clavicle is near the surface, and you can feel those too, and indeed the sternum. But let's say, so we've got 2 ends, inner and outer ends of the clavicles, therefore giving that shoulder tilt, and we've got the inferred sweep of the vertebral column. Now let's go back to this weight-taking leg. In fact, although the general feel of the length of the leg is straight, what happens is that the thigh goes to the knee, and then there's a bit of a change of direction. So typically, here's another point where the bone comes to the surface, the patella or knee, and then the whole of the length of the tibia or shin is actually bony. It's if you hit your shin, you know it. It's not covered by muscle. That comes down and joins the foot at the ankle, and there's an inner and outer ankle, and the inner one is higher than the outer one. So you have 2 points at the ankle, point at the knee, point at the pelvis. Now this leg isn't doing a lot, it's not supporting, but you can't contract it, so the pelvis is just going to be just as long. So if it starts from a lower point, it's going to end up at a lower point too. And then because it's not doing any work, it's just bent, and we have the other inner and outer ankle again. And then the point where it's meeting the ground is liable to be, say, something like that. Now, this is the trunk. We have a cage of ribs here, which is a shape rather like that. Not much of that can be seen. It's pretty well covered with muscle. You get even when you think you see ribs, unless they're very thin, they generally aren't. They're another muscle that comes in from the back. The arms depend from this. Let's say this one is got an arm resting on the hip. So you get pivot points that come to the surface at the elbow. Actually, there are three, but just for a moment, let's talk about only the central elbow. There's one each side of the central elbow as well. You come down, and again, 2 points at the wrist, and let's say the hand is doing something like that. This one we'll assume is just falling. It's not doing anything much. Pivot point, 2 pivot points. Now, if we just give that flesh, there's another one which I'm just going to mention here, which is, although the pelvic girdle is the thing you can see here, the femur, the thigh bone, is not quite as simple as I'm representing it here. It does in fact have a little change of direction here, with a ball which inserts into a socket into the pelvis, and a change of direction like that. Now this makes another little protuberance. It's not always too easy to see, but it does cause the hip to be wider often at that point than it is actually at the top of the pelvis. So that makes that shape. So that's a typical pose where the weight is taken strongly by one hip from the front.